We'll be getting started momentarily. I see people joining us in the Zoom room. Welcome, thank you for coming in. And we just went on to Facebook. So we are going to get started. Okay. Welcome to the third panel of the Social Vision Conference. This is the end of our first day. This will be our last panel today. We have we had a great day so far, and this is going to be another great panel. I'm very excited for it. We have two awesome speakers. And I just want to remind everyone to please join us again tomorrow and Wednesday and Thursday. Tomorrow we start, I think every day for the next 3 days, we start at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So please join us. We have a ton of, I think another 18 speakers, something like that. So please come check those out. And all the information can be found on interconnectedness.net. The registration information and the program can be found there. And I'll also just remind our viewers, if you like what you're seeing and you like this type of learning, then we have a learning fellowship that we're going to be running probably in the spring. And I can put that information in the chat. So if you have any undergraduate or graduate level students that you think would be interested, you could send that information to them. And if you don't fall into that category but are interested in the learning, definitely still apply, and we'll find a way to be learning together. And with that, I will hand it off to our moderator today, Rabbi Benjamin Murray. And yeah, take it away, Rabbi.
Thank you. I'll just take a moment to introduce our first speaker, Professor Loewenthal from the Royal Holloway University College of London. Kate Loewenthal is an Emeritus Professor of Psychology at the Royal Holloway London University and is currently a visiting professor at Glyndŵr University in Wales. And also the University of Chester, is a Distinguished Research Fellow at New York University in London. She has taught at the Universities of London and Wales, and her research is focused on mental health in minority groups in the UK. She's interested in how religious factors relate to mental health and is currently working both on spirituality and trauma therapy and on anti-Semitism. She has been involved in providing and evaluating culture-sensitive mental health supportive services, and she has published several books on religion, including Religion, Culture, and Mental Health in 2007, and over 150 academic articles. Wow. She's married to Naftali Loewenthal, and they have a very large family, thank God. Today, she'll be speaking about trauma and faith. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to you, Professor. Very, very much looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Mari Benjamin, if I may, for introducing me, and also Jonah. And it's very nice to be sharing this session with Marcia. Hello, Marcia. And I want to talk about two preconceptions which are, I'm sure everybody knows they're wrong, but I just want to make sure that's all this talk is doing is dealing with those wrong, inaccurate preconceptions. And those two preconceptions are, number one, that trauma destroys faith, and number two, that psychotherapy is about a therapist who is all powerful and is going to cure the patient who is not in much of a position of power. And I want this talk to say that illustrating the principle of reciprocity, the patient probably does more for the therapist than the other way around, and illustrating the idea that trauma has an effect on faith. I want in this talk to illustrate the ways in which trauma can deepen and make faith more powerful. So now I've said the whole point of the talk. You don't really need to listen anymore. But let me just go through what I've prepared now, and thank you for being here and attending. So I want in my talk, I hope to first of all raise the questions behind this conference and say something about reciprocity and psychotherapy. psychotherapy, give a very concise summary of Philip Wexler's account of the Rebbe's emphasis on reciprocity, and then talk about, but first of all, psychotherapy and reciprocity, and second of all, a form of therapy called EMDR, which is a trauma therapy, and finally, I want to say something about my hobby horse, which is religion and spirituality, experienced in dealing with mental health, and in this case, experienced in EMDR, the trauma therapy. And I want to make a conclusion. So I'm trying to keep an eye on the time, which, because I was told that I only had a quarter of an hour. Is that true, Benjamin?
Yes, unfortunately it is.
Yes, okay. It's okay. I did a practice run and I got it down to a quarter of an hour. So here we go. So here are the questions underlying this conference, or rather underlying this talk, and they're related to the questions underlying the conference. I want first of all to give some kind of answer to what does Jewish spirituality give us to deal with society's most pressing issues. And in this case, we're going to be looking at traumatic events. And I also want to mention, it doesn't hang particularly neatly into the theme of the talk, but I want to mention a very important thing that most of us, I think, who've been associated with Chabad have had in mind, which is the Rebbe's emphasis on 1 minute of silence in the school day. His idea that this simple maneuver could improve spiritual awareness in wider society. And I finally want to, in this introduction, I want to say that in Philip Wexler's account of the Rebbe's emphasis on reciprocity, he points out reciprocity at 3 levels. It's been pointed out by other speakers that reciprocity isn't an exchange of similar goods. It's a process in which more develops. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and more develops as a result of interactions both between individuals and also between individuals and the community, their friends, their family and the community, and also reciprocity extends to relations with the divine. So, I want to say that psychotherapy definitely is a wonderful example of reciprocity in action. Psychotherapy is the treatment of mental or emotional disorder or related ills by psychological means. And there are different types of psychotherapy, as I'm sure you're all aware. And the 2 best known are psychodynamic therapy and cognitive behavior therapy. Psychodynamic therapy involves a lot of talking, and it basically is aimed to enable the client to deal with things that are too painful for them to normally think about. And so they're tying their lives in knots in order to avoid facing this pain. And hence there are psychological and or physical symptoms and other difficulties. And in this form of therapy, the client gains a greater level of conscious control over their behavior and over their feelings. And although this is done in the background by the therapist, in therapeutic training, to put it perhaps oversimply, therapists are told the less you do, the better, and much more than you think should be left to the client. Cognitive behavior therapy improves people's awareness of their habits of behavior, thinking and feeling, and develops improved control. It's a more rational and conscious process. I'm introducing psychotherapy as a reciprocal relationships. It's not a a therapist who's got somehow superior knowledge of the workings of the human mind, helping the client to achieve a better awareness of the workings of his or her mind. It's a process in which the therapist becomes more aware of the workings of his or her own mind. In psychodynamic therapy, this is usually or often said to be particularly evident in the way the therapist becomes aware of his or her own feelings that are awoken by the client. So there's a reciprocal relationship which involves the development of new feelings and new awareness on both sides. And also therapy can involve a reciprocal relationship, can and should involve a reciprocal relationship with the divine. And I want in this talk to keep reverting to my hobby horse, which is the importance of considering spirituality and religiosity in the treatment of mental health, and in this case, therapy. I won't spell out these two slides because they simply spell out some of the processes involved in regular therapy, and I want to pass on to the issue of trauma, which I think is a huge issue dominating our lives in the 21st century. Gordon Allport's classic study included a careful recording of the experiences of World War II veterans who found their faith had been shaken by their traumatic experiences. Some had lost their faith and others had developed a more mature faith. And the puzzle for us is, which way are we going to go if, heaven forbid, we're traumatized and experience something too dreadful the survivor's story. I feel frightened to say it in detail. It's a horrific story, but basically it arose from a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust who witnessed the SS destroying the people of his village. I won't go into more details because I don't think I'm capable of saying it and doing it justice. But he had lost his faith as a result of this, and this is unfortunately something that very, very often happens. How can God allow this? How can God make us in such a way that evil people do evil things? There's a general pattern with trauma, which is that no matter what form it takes, it gives rise to both existential doubt and questioning and spiritual seeking. And this has been described by several authors. I just want to illustrate some of the forms of trauma that a therapist might come across, and that unfortunately are all too commonly experienced in this in these times. The first on the left, the emergency services are very prone to traumatic stress disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, because of the number of occasions on which they have to witness events such as this. In this case, this is a man leaping off a bridge. The second slide looks at survivors of an earthquake, recognizing one of their loved ones. The third is a lady who's experienced sexual abuse, rape, and the fourth is somebody who's experienced a trauma resulting from torture. These are all so horrific to think about, And there are other less dramatic forms of trauma in which people can experience emotional trauma. For instance, just somebody saying something devastatingly nasty to them. And this is often recognized by family and child therapists, where children spend their childhood being put down and made to feel totally unworthy and belittled by parents who are trying to be good parents, but the only way they know how is to tell the child that what they're doing is not worth anything. I spent many years teaching psychology, doing research in psychology, doing research in clinical psychology, in different forms of psychological disorder. And relatively recently, in fact, after I retired, I started to become very enthusiastic about a form of therapy called EMDR, which I've been talking about briefly in my classes for some time. And I began to hear people talking about how effective it was. And I decided to find out more, and was thankfully allowed to train in it. I won't go into details of what it involves, but it's basically a treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a very deeply disturbing condition. And it's been dimly known about, especially since World War I, but not recognized as a psychiatric condition, and not recognized as a treatable condition until probably after the Korean or the Vietnam War. And there are still, unfortunately, many thousands of combat survivors who have been deeply traumatized and have not been helped. And EMDR therapists are now making frantic attempts to try to help as many people as possible, often using group methods that are developing rapidly right now. It involves a process called bilateral stimulation, in which alternate sides of the brain are stimulated. The original form of therapy got its name eye movement desensitization, because it involved the therapist moving their finger from side to side, and the movements were followed by the client's eyes, and it was found that the level of distress associated with a traumatic memory was reduced, and indeed could be removed by this process of bilateral stimulation. There are other things involved which are more recognizable as familiar therapy, but this element, bilateral stimulation, obviously involves neural processes, and it is bizarre sounding, but it's now recognized, certainly in the Western countries. There's been a huge amount of research on it, and it's been recognized as something which actually deals very effectively and very rapidly with many forms of trauma. I started practicing it about 5 to 6 years ago, and some of my clients came from the Orthodox Jewish community, and some of my clients came from a website that I had, a little website which mentioned that I specialized in trauma therapy. This is a table involving 15 clients, and I've grouped them into 3 groups. The largest group are those who had both a religious and spiritual identity. That's not representative of the general population necessarily, but it happens to be that I started off doing trauma therapy in a religious community. And so I was getting my first results from people with a religious and spiritual identity. But then I began to include people who said they were spiritual but not religious, which is a very popular, relatively popular form of identity in the Western world. And I also had some clients who had no identity involving religion or spirituality. They simply had nothing in their upbringing, they said, and they weren't interested. What we see here in this table is that those who had a religious and spiritual identity, all in my sample anyway, all reported an improvement in religious faith. I wasn't looking for this, but my clients started to tell me, it's wonderful, I feel so much better, and I feel that my faith has been restored. And this was true for all the, and then I asked others, and what basically I found was that if people had a prior religious or spiritual identity, they reported that this form of trauma therapy had a helpful and deepening effect on their religious faith and their spirituality. And those who hadn't had any religious background and didn't have any kind of conceptual framework involving religion or spirituality, weren't aware of any religious or spiritual changes. Here are some things that were said by some of the clients. This first page, quotations from the Jewish clients. I won't read them through, I'll just leave them there for a moment so you can have a look at them. And on the second page, we have some quotations of the descriptions of the experiences, thoughts and ideas of the non-Jewish clients, those who had a religious and spiritual background. What we're seeing is the experiences of people who found an extraordinary, at least it seemed to me, extraordinary religious spiritual effect of this form of therapy on their religious faith. Now, it is true that over the 100 years or so that psychotherapy has been popularly practiced. It's been found that those therapists who are interested in spiritual awareness and religious issues have reported that forms of psychotherapy can result in an improvement in spiritual awareness. My work suggests that focusing particularly on trauma therapy, there's those who've had any kind of spiritual or religious background are likely to report a deepening of religious faith and trust. And this is something that is part of the reciprocation of the involved in the therapeutic process. There's also improved well-being and social relationships, very rewarding for the therapist, and illustrates, I think, the importance of belief and respect for the divine in improving the outcome of the therapeutic process. Now, how am I doing for time? Have I done my 15 minutes, Brennan?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much for listening. I'm sure I know there are things that got tangled and other things I wanted to say, but thank you very much for listening to the main points that I wanted to make. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And I think we'll hold questions until after Professor Brennan has a chance to share her thoughts and her words, and then we'll have a conversation together. So if I may, I'd like to introduce Professor Marcia Brennan from Rice University. She is the Carolyn and Fred McManus Professor of Humanities at Rice University. and a professor of art history and religious studies. She's also a literary artist on the oncology unit of the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania, and she is an artist in residence at the Department of Palliative Care and Rehabilitation Medicine at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center. She has authored numerous books in her field of modernist art, history, and the medical humanities. Her most recent volume, A Rose from Two Gardens, Saint Therese of, I'm going to mispronounce this, maybe you could actually say this word for me, of
Lisieux.
Sorry, Lisieux, thank you.
Yeah.
And Images of the End of Life. And this will be published by the University of California Medical Humanities Press later this year. Today, she's focusing her remarks on the interconnectedness and end of life. And with that, Professor, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Kate, thank you so much for the talk that you just gave as well. I think and hope that we'll be able to have a very interesting conversation regarding spirituality and practice. Wonderful. Okay, thank you, Rabbi Murray. And also my thanks go to Philip Wexler, Jonah Gelfand, and Jesse Noiley for their kind invitation to speak again at a Social Vision conference. This is the second time that I'm doing this. Okay. My talk, it'll be sort of more formal. It will be about 10 minutes that I'll be speaking, and then we will have a lot of time then for questions and answers and perhaps thinking together about the pragmatic as well as the metaphysical and transcendent dimensions of the topics that we're addressing. So while my talk relates to the principle of reciprocity between self, community, and cosmos, it does not address issues concerning gender, incarceration, or ecology. Instead, I'll share a story that exemplifies the transformative value of interpersonal encounters. More specifically, the story I'm going to tell you speaks to issues of balance and reciprocity between the living and the dying. The story is drawn directly from my clinical experiences as an artist in residence in the Department of Palliative Care and Rehabilitation Medicine at the MD Anderson Cancer Center. Just as the story engages themes of emptiness and fullness, it allows us to re-envision what is ugly and what is truly beautiful in life and at the end of life. And even in my choice of words there, you're hearing resonances with themes that come up within Social Vision. Okay, so one day I worked with a very sweet, very elderly man who was a Holocaust survivor and who would ultimately pass away later that evening. The story of our encounter sheds light on key themes that arise in Chapter 4 of Social Vision, where Philip Wexler examines Rebbe Schneerson's views on balance and reciprocity, giving and receiving, the individual and the collective, as well as the existential and the metaphysical. As we shall see, this story also speaks directly to the value of an interpersonal encounter in which intimate communications convey a sense of, quote, inherent mutuality in which all participants are empowered and endowed with dignity, end quote. And that last phrase is coming from page 111 of Social Vision. As we reflect on these themes, we recognize the ways in which the secular can become sacralized. Now, let me provide some brief context for my encounter with this man and his family. So in my day job, I am indeed a professor of the humanities at Rice University, where my teaching and my research engage the fields of modern and contemporary art history, museum studies, religious studies, and the medical humanities. In addition, since early 2009, it has also been my privilege to serve as a literary artist in residence in the Department of Palliative Care and Rehabilitation Medicine at MD Anderson Cancer Center. And then since early 2021, I've expanded this practice to work with general oncology patients at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania. In all contexts, this work engages the intersection of literary aesthetics and psychosocial oncology. So, what exactly do I do? I visit with people facing advanced illness and the end of life, and I record the narratives and images that are meaningful for them at this time. Within this intimate practice, patients and caregivers provide the content of the stories, while I provide the practical means for the artwork's realization. As I visit with people, I write down their words verbatim, and then I arrange them into their phrases into successive lines that resemble poetry. At the end of the visit, I read the person's words back to them, and I invite them to make any additions or corrections that they wish. When I work in the hospital at the bedside, I inscribe the narrative into a handmade paper journal, which the person is able to keep as a gift for themselves and their family. In this way, the journal becomes something delicate yet tangible, so it's something to hold on to as all else is slipping away. When I work remotely with my patients in Pennsylvania, I subsequently email people their story. In all cases, all of the work is done in a single sitting, and all of the words are the person's own. And this is crucial. They must be their own. If it sounds like me, the narrative is not good for anything. So as this suggests, as an artist, I work in the media of language and human consciousness. I would even venture to say that as a teacher, I do something similar, as we all do. There's no single protocol for our creative interactions. Because each person and each situation are unique, I allow the circumstances to guide the work. In this way, the encounters are characterized by a sense of openness and reciprocity. So that's the general contextual setup. Just as I work with language, however, sometimes caring for people at the very end of life entails attention to the subtle vocabulary that arises when individuals speak in a language of silence, when they communicate through overflowing gestures made with empty hands. You're already starting to hear some of the paradoxical implications of my language and in fact of the practice itself. And it's there that we can get into the conversation as well regarding the pragmatic aspects of the clinical encounters and then the philosophical aspects of the topics worth reflecting on in social vision. Yeah, okay. So one day I met the family of an extremely elderly man who was on the threshold of actively dying and who would ultimately pass away later that evening. While visiting with the man's family, I learned that he was a Holocaust survivor and that his childhood experiences growing up in Eastern Europe had directly shaped his personal character and how he lived his life. Even as he lay dying, the man's bearing and expression were filled with light and grace. At that point, the man could no longer speak, and he drifted in and out of consciousness while we created a tribute to him. The man's wife of nearly 6 decades and the family members who had assembled in the room all contributed to the narrative. They shared details of the man's life history and his personal character, vividly describing the things he loved to do and his overall love for people. They also provided some choice examples of the man's clever and sarcastic sense of humor. These were their words, not mine. And they reflected on the greater impact that he had made on the world and on the people around him. So I sat there with this family for about an hour and crafted their narrative. When I told the family that the story was complete and I prepared to read it aloud, the man at the end of life opened his eyes, looked directly into my eyes, and beckoned me to his side. I returned his gaze and I introduced myself. He held out his left hand, which I took in my right hand as I read the artwork aloud. The man followed along closely, and he smiled and even laughed softly at one point. When I had finished reading, the man squeezed my hand, and then, with his right index finger, he made a sweeping circular gesture around the room, indicating how much he loved his family and how much he valued each of them. I have never forgotten the tenderness of this encounter or the inclusive power of the man's circular gesture. During this visit, the man's empty hands overflowed with meaning as he spoke eloquently in a language of silence. Okay, so that's our story. Now, returning to the themes of social vision. And this was why I just absolutely could not say no. When I got that email from Phil Wexler and from Jonah, I'm like, oh my gosh, I've got to do this. Okay, here it is. Here's why. So as I noted at the outset, this is a story of giving and receiving. And now I'm paraphrasing a lot of language in social vision. And I'm just going to go ahead and give the page numbers whenever I'm citing social vision. This is a story of giving and receiving, page 111, that engages both the individual and the collective, 126. During this modest yet remarkable encounter, everyone in the room, including the frail elderly man at the end of his life, was, quote, empowered and endowed with dignity, 111. The story offers a unique perspective on issues of inclusivity, while showing the ways in which a person's life can be seen as a pathway for the distribution of blessings. 123. Okay. Ultimately, this is a story of intimacy and proximity that speaks at once to issues of contingency, fragility, and power. In this encounter, presence creates space for absence, while absence creates a space for presence. Nested within this reciprocal formulation is a simultaneous sense of negation and affirmation, of emptiness and fullness, of humility and grandeur. This story thus allows us to see what ordinarily cannot be seen. And this comes up again and again when I'm reading about the Rebbe's teachings in social vision. There's this process of enabling us to see and to mark it consciously, what ordinarily cannot be seen, as we grasp the power of an absence that encompasses and contains all things within a gesture that holds nothing, yet which potentially holds everything. Okay, I just did something kind of fancy there, so I'm going to repeat that sentence. This is the teacher in me. I know I'm speaking at a conference here, but it's the move back and forth and back and forth. So it's the reweaving. So I'm going to just repeat this. The story allows us to see what ordinarily cannot be seen as we grasp the power of an absence that both encompasses and contains all things within a gesture that holds nothing, yet which potentially holds everything. Notably, even though these qualities are subtle and impalpable, they are clearly evident and readily discernible. And here I would very self-consciously use the term trace. By engaging these themes, the story speaks to the value of the coincidence of opposites, just as it gifts us with a new perspective on holding the unholdable. Okay, here I would make a more general observation, namely, people at the end of life can be seen as occupying a crucial transitional position that both incorporates and mediates between multiple worlds at once. In so doing, their presences can evoke a sense of the existential and the otherworldly, of distance and proximity as simultaneous propositions. Following Rebbe Schneerson's teachings, if we approach the world receptively, then we can see how we may all learn from every person and how we all learn from one another. This comes up the discussion, page 118 of Social Vision. In so doing, the physical world can appear as a revelation of the numinous. Thus, even though there is nothing conventionally pretty about the story I've just told you, and that's not within the chapter that we're looking at today, but the pretty and the ugly, that's within Social Vision and elsewhere, obviously. So even though there is nothing conventionally pretty about this story, it is still intensely beautiful. And in its unfolding, the secular appears to be sacred. As Philip Wexler points out, the Rebbe's teachings emphasize the great value of perceiving transcendence, quote, as it is immanently embodied in ordinary life, including in the face of any and every individual whom you encounter, 118, and that is coming from the Rebbe. I would just say, in conclusion, expanding this line of thought through the principle of reciprocity, I would suggest that perhaps we can perceive such transcendence not only in a person's face, but in their hands as well. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. That was beautiful. I would like to give you each a chance to respond to each other's comments first. Professor
Sure.
Loewenthal, you're muted. You can unmute. Feel free to unmute yourself. Or perhaps I could do that for you. Okay. First of all, thank you so much for both being here. It was really very moving to hear both of your presentations. If Marcia or Kate, do you have anything you'd like to say to each other before I start asking questions?
Sure, I'd just like to thank Kate and again, Social Vision and you too, Benjamin, for the gift of presence and of being present, for hearing all this. I mean, Kate's talking about trauma. I'm talking about the end of life, right? So quite the party we've got going on here. These are all of which is to say, these are not easy topics. And I recognize that issues of trauma and the end of life represent, the capital fear of most people, right? And so thank you for venturing into this territory. I will say that listening to Kate, I'm struck by the ways in which it is so clear from your tone, not only that there's great compassion, but that it's a gift and a privilege to be allowed, in a sense, to be present while the work unfolds. And so just as we're here in a kind of very practical, very human, very embodied way, listening to all that's unfolding, there is also this element, very self-consciously, of spirituality that's constantly unfolding. And that I'm, after 12 years doing this work, I just believe that nothing would really be possible. None of this could even happen were that not so consciously foregrounded in my own mind, at least, as all this is happening. And Kate, I heard overtones of that in your work as well, particularly as you're emphasizing the reciprocity, again, between the recipient and the giver. And so I was very struck by that, and I just found it to be so lovely.
Yes. I only want to comment at this point that I think we're both finding, have found and are finding that the helper receives more than they feel they've given or are able to give. And I wanted to ask, I know that I'm sure that this is if I'm being too nosy, please, what inspired you to? I mean, your work, your basic work and training is as a creative artist, yes.
No, I'm a scholar. I'm a modernist art historian. My first field, I'm a modernist art historian.
Oh, right. So, but you're an academic. You feel you're an academic before you're an artist, because the way you were describing your work made it very. It seemed to make it very apparent to me that you have emerged with some wonderful creations, and so that was a preliminary to my comment, which is my question, which is how did you discover and what inspired you to work with people at the end of life?
Thank you. Yeah, what inspired this is that there's always a story. Yeah, and that is that I was in my early 40s at the time that I began to do this. And I met a woman who is a medical doctor. So Houston is we live in Houston and work in Houston. It's a very interesting city in that there's a very important museum district. We have our research university, but it's also, our campus sits at the edge of the largest medical center in the world, literally. The Texas Med Center is technically which is an incredible claim, but it is so. It's the largest medical center in the world. And so within these communities, there is some porousness, friends, colleagues, people you meet here and there. So through friends at the Menil Collection, which is a major modernist art museum and collection in Houston, I was introduced to a woman who was exactly my age, who was an oncologist, who had come to MD Anderson to do phase 1 clinical trials, epigenetic mechanisms, running clinical trials, et cetera. She was coming from Weill Cornell Medical College to take her appointment at MD Anderson. And in her spare time, she decided to found a nonprofit organization called Collage, the Art for Cancer Network. So this is Dr. Jennifer Wheeler. So Jennifer and I met through mutual friends at the Menil. And from the moment we met, it was sort of like I was meeting a sister. And so Jennifer had this nonprofit, and I admired it very, very much while I was doing all my academic things at Rice. And then what happened was I got to a point where I had finished another one of my books, and we were at dinner one night, and I just said to her, I think you should trigger the paperwork for the credentialing process. I want to go work at MD Anderson. And she's like, really? I'm like, yeah. And so the other artists in the nonprofit at that time were all visual artists. They were all doing various kinds of visual artwork at the bedside. There was no precedent for the literary artist. I had no idea what I was going to do. Kate, I thought I would do journaling. I mean, that's sort of a standard thing one does. But from the moment that I got in there, that I just knew that listening and receptivity were more important, witnessing and presence were more important than anything that I could ever try to actively incite along creation. And so then it struck me that the end of life in so many ways is about disintegration and destruction, to have the possibility for coextensive destruction and creation unfolding in the same space struck me as just absolutely mind-blowing and extraordinary. And so I decided that I would try to do this and to follow it through language. And so the practice just evolved in this way. The final part of the answer, and I'll stop over answering, is that I had reached a point in my career where I had done so much academic work. I wanted to be doing work for more than 12 other people at Yale, right? I wanted to do work that would have broader impact, and I say that rather glibly, but that would have impacts beyond hopefully just the academic community. As an art historian, I'm privileged to look at the most beautiful and exquisite things in the world. I spend time looking at Rembrandt and Monet and Cézanne. When I'm with end of life and terminal cancer patients, I'm looking at some of the most difficult and traumatic things. I wanted to be able to go to the full spectrum of both places to see and to show that the light was present in both places. And that is also part of what has guided this work. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. I don't want to take a turn when I'm not entitled to it, but
Please, go ahead.
This is probably going to be my last question, but could you comment on the spiritual aspects of what's going on when you are when you're with somebody who's clearly reaching the end of life and they know it?
It's absolutely extraordinary. In the 12 years, you can't do this work, working in acute palliative care inpatient, when not see extraordinary things. And it does change you in ways that are all for the better. So the unit that I work on is a 12-bed inpatient unit, and it is non-denominational. It's the University of Texas, right? So it's a secular institution. But what that means is that in one room, right, you can have a fundamentalist Christian, and the next an atheist, and the next a Buddhist, and the next, right, a Catholic, a Jew, and the next, and you just go around, and it can be anything and everything. In doing this work, I have come to see that there's really no place where grace is not present. And just to be able to stand back and watch as this unfolds, I mean, what can you do other than bow your head and say, thank you so much for the privilege of being allowed to be present while I have just witnessed extraordinary things. By listening to people, they are all my teachers. They're all my teachers. You come to see that there can be a world of meaning in seemingly the simplest and humblest and most familiar object, that there is absolutely no place where the sacred does not go. And yes, in the face of every person, just as the Rebbe said, one can see and one can encounter the presence of the numinous. And it comes through the gestures, it comes through the tenderness, it comes through the light in their eyes, it comes through everything. Everything speaks. And it's just been an enormous privilege to be there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Brennan, I'd like to give you an opportunity if you have any questions for Professor Loewenthal. Please feel free to.
Yes. So I'm interested in the fact that your patients do come from various backgrounds, religious as well as identified as non. And I'm just curious, when you are with a patient who is not identifying spirituality or religion within their background, how that is handled essentially. Do you just create space? Do you recognize things that they are not able to recognize within their own narratives or within what's unfolding? Do you introduce that through language, or do you simply allow whatever unfolds to unfold?
Thank you for that question. And I should confess at once that having pranced around for about 20 years or more, saying that when we're talking about mental health and dealing with mental health and trying to help people whose mental health is they wish it could be better, we must make sure that we ask about spiritual and religious matters if they haven't spontaneously mentioned it. There's a lot of academic and clinical work now which shows that on the whole, people would like to have more opportunity when they're talking about mental health and receiving treatment, helpful treatment for it. They would like the spirituality to be taken into account. Okay, so the so-called big shot, let's make sure we cover religion and spirituality when we're talking about mental health. I was doing this therapy without saying a word. I didn't get round the, and I suppose I could excuse myself by saying, well, look, the training didn't include it. But I'll now say to myself, well, look, Kate, you should have included it. You should have, and I now do try. To include it, but to introduce it as a topic, and you can see from the quotations that I included that people had some very powerful experiences. And in many cases, they wouldn't have said anything about them if I hadn't asked. And in the United Kingdom, the Royal College of Psychiatrists has got its own special interest group focusing on spiritual matters. The British Psychological Society hasn't been so advanced in this respect, but the Royal College of Psychiatrists has done some very, very valuable work, just basically encouraging clinicians to introduce these topics with patients and clients, and some very moving experiences for the clinician and hopefully for the client can be the result. I wanted to say something very important, and it's gone completely out of my head. What was the original question, Marcia?
Oh, just that when you are with patients who claim not to have a spiritual or religious background, and they are giving their narrative in their account, I'm thinking that you're perhaps able to see and identify things that might fall under the rubric of the spiritual that they themselves cannot recognize. And I'm just wondering what you do with that, if anything.
Well, here's a very embarrassing point at which I make an excuse, which the short answer is that yes, sometimes people will talk about what they don't believe and why they don't believe and how they can't understand, and I think this session is encouraging me to focus more on that. What are the feelings and ideas that people have about non-belief when they claim that they are a non-believer? There's some very important things being said there. But I also want to, as it were, make the excuse, which is that the therapy that I'm practicing, EMDR, works, and it works very quickly usually. And so there isn't, and all this stuff about doing bilateral stimulation takes quite a lot of time, so that we don't get a lot of talking done, and so but nevertheless this conversation is encouraging me, as well as my own clinical experience with religion and spirituality, which is becoming richer over the years, encouraging me to introduce more and more this topic into this form of therapy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Loewenthal, I had a question. It seemed from the chart that you had showed there was a much higher rate of success with someone with a religious or spiritual background or underpinnings. And I was wondering why you thought that was the case.
Well, my tiny mind went back to some research that I've been doing about 20 years previously, and it's a kind of corny answer, but I think it needs to be said. We need, I think, to be equipping children with a conceptual framework that will enable them to think about spirituality and deal with spirituality. And if they haven't got that framework, it's may not happen. The research that I'm referring to was 20 years ago. It was a completely different kind of research, but it was looking at distressing and traumatic life events and their effects on mental health. And we included in the research design some attempts to inquire into and measure people's religious upbringing, people's religious practice, current religious practice, people's current religious ideas, and we were trying to look at the effects of that on how they're feeling now in the context of the distress that they're undergoing. And yes, you know, in common with other research, not always of the same design, but of the same, asking the same sort of questions about whether religion can help with distress. We were finding that people who had a set of religious ideas were better in terms of their mental health. They were less distressed and happier. And it brings me back to what I was struggling to say, that if we don't give people a framework, ideally in childhood, but you know, whenever, then it's not going to happen. There's no way of, or there's much less chance of imposing this kind of structure on our feelings and ideas if we don't have the tools to do it. And you know, it's a very, very down to earth, and I'm sure not everybody would agree, but I'm just saying that empirically, you know, it's hit me from at least two different directions, and really rather a large number of years of research, that people have got to be brought up. Then I know there's a whole school of thought that, you know, people are naturally spiritual and they will have spiritual experiences and ideas and so on. Sure, but okay, it happens, but on the other hand, it seems to be less likely to happen.
If I could drill a little bit deeper and try to understand, I want to also bounce your remarks off of Marcia, but let me try to reframe, just to make sure that I'm clear on it. I want to reframe it and then open it up to Marcia. So it seems to me that those who have some sort of religious or spiritual background, and just to kind of define that a little bit more, is it a daily practice, a daily ritual, feelings of gratitude in the morning, a gratitude journal, like some sort of meditation practices? What is that kind of envelope that you're describing as religious ideas or religious practices? That's one. And the second is that you mentioned a moment of silence earlier in your remarks. For those of you who don't know, I had it in my public school when I was growing up. It was 60 to 90 seconds of silence, and the principal would get on the PA system. For a few years, he played Aretha Franklin's Respect, the first part of it, that everyone should have that frame of mind during school. And there was a Pledge of Allegiance and a moment of silence. And it was just a small reflective period at the beginning of the day for children in public schools to center ourselves before we go into learning. And it's really up to the parents to talk to their children about what they should be thinking about during that time, not the public schools or the teachers' domain to influence that time. So I wanted to kind of bounce these ideas off of Marcia. Sorry, I forgot. I didn't give you a chance to respond, of that envelope of religious and spiritual practice. And maybe Marcia, you could also chime in on that. What would you describe that as? How would you put words to what that means in a broader context, possibly outside of someone who has their own religious practices?
Shall I respond, or are you?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so it's very, very interesting. Again, I see the range of it all. I see people who have very definite religious practices and that have particular, modalities of ritual, belief, faith, et cetera, that accompany them. Then I see others who have a blended kind of practice where they are very much introducing, well, I was raised in this tradition, but here's where I am now. And it's their kind of take on things. And then there are others who get to the point where, especially I'd say get very close to the end of life, where the whole world can appear to be illuminated. And so you get a sense of gratitude, you get a sense of the immanent and the transcendent becoming convergent even in some of these spaces. And you do see that. You see that sometimes in general oncology, but you really do see that in acute palliative care inpatient, where everything and everyone become to take on a heightened meaning where you are looking at something greater than yourself, but something with which you are also integrated. And so there becomes a continuum and a kind of porousness of consciousness where the secular and the sacred, the distinctions themselves, no longer obtain as distinctions. There's almost a convergent place of oneness, and it's just extraordinary. And that kind of convergence, I've seen it at the end of life. I've seen it when I'm talking with holy people, essentially. And I also see it sometimes when there's a brand new baby. And this is very, very interesting. And so the alpha and the omega around the transcendent and that relationship between the immanent and the transcendent, always filled with love, always filled with gratitude. And you can feel it. You can feel it empathically as much as you can be present in it and process it cognitively.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much. Professor Loewenthal, do you have any closing, Professor Brennan, do you have any closing remarks on how, you're both in slightly different areas with trauma and end-of-life care, but the benefits of having of seeing the world as interconnected and having a spiritual life is very clear through both of your talks. And it'd be beautiful if we could figure out a way as a society not to have to come to the end of life to have these realizations. Like, let's live our entire life, 120 years, with this level of realization. Do you have any tips of how we could bring this into our daily lives?
Do you want to go first, Kate?
Yeah. Oh, no. Well, you look as you look as if you've got something to say in response to that.
Sure. I think hearing the words of people at the end of life are very powerful. This is why I've now written 3 books on this. The minute that we can stop being so afraid, but to listen, to actually listen to what's being said, you never know what will stay with somebody, what the image will be, what the symbol. One of the amazing things is I've seen these spiritual revelations come up around sometimes the most banal object, and you can never, ever tell what the trigger will be, ever. You can never tell. I also think having conferences like this where we're discussing it, I think this idea that we can encounter the divine in the face of every person we encounter, I think that is absolutely beautiful and powerful. And so the more occasions we have to reinforce that idea, the better that we are, the better that the world is.
Thank you. Kate, do you have anything you'd like to add, or not necessarily add, but to say on your own?
As we've been talking, I've been thinking that there are the things that I should be doing that I would like to do as a result of this our discussion. In particular, the empirical work that I've been talking about has basically involved people under enormous stress. the earlier work that I was talking, we were looking at serious life events, not necessarily traumatic, but still very, very unpleasant. And more recently, I've been looking at trauma. And I think what's happened is that we've got this, I don't know what word to use, this kind of bifurcation that was originally described by Gordon Allport in the middle of the 20th century, which is that when very bad things happen to people, good people, you get this either a heightening of spirituality as a result of the searching and exploring that's done, or you get this anger, this rejection, or this extreme sadness is too weak a word, lowness, emptiness. And so what this has inspired me to think more about and do more about is this second group of people who've been suffered so much and who have felt forced or unable to admit the idea of God and spirituality, these kinds of feelings. I'd like to talk more with the non-believers and see what's going on there. There's certainly something spiritual, but it's a very extraordinary and obviously inaccessible, but nevertheless there, form of spirituality.
Thank you. And just one comment came in on the chat from someone who's in the Zoom room, one of our conference participants, responding to the question of what could we do. He wrote, encouraging moment of silence or actual prayer to the infinite seems like a good way forward. With that, unfortunately, I can't believe the time just flew by. I looked like 30 or 40 minutes ago, and I was like, oh, we have so much time. And as we got talking, it really went very fast. And I'm really very interested in reading more of your work and following you more now that I've gotten such a great chance to meet you. And we have a few more days of really amazing content at the conference. If you check out interconnectedness.net, there you could sign up if you'd like to come inside to the Zoom session, be able to ask questions, or you could stream on the various streaming services. Tomorrow morning, we're starting at 10 with an interplay between the self and the other and lived experience. And also, if you're interested also in interconnectedness, there is right now we're calling it a fellowship for students, both undergraduate students and graduate students, to become a little bit more involved in this field and connect people to spiritual sources in a wide variety of disciplines. And with that, I would like to thank both of you again, Professor Brennan and Professor Loewenthal, for sharing your afternoon with us. It was a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so Denise will close the live portion now.